because we are looking at soil like some industrial machine that we put in so much and we have to get so much. But soil is a living thing. If you take a handful of soil, there are anywhere between 7 to 10 billion organisms in it.
Scientists are terrified. Governments are hiding this. And one dying monk just made the biggest mistake of his life by telling the world the truth. For 60 years, a secret brotherhood in China guarded something buried beneath Mount Kailash that should not exist. Something that rewrites all of human history. Something powerful enough that people who got too close ended up dead.
This happened in 2060. A few scientists from the planet got an appointment with God. They wanted to meet him. They went there and said, "Hey, old man, you've done pretty well with creation, but today everything that you can do, we can also do. It's time you retire."
In 2024, a 94-year-old monk finally revealed what is down there. And I promise you, the moment you hear this, you will never look at the world the same way again. This changes everything. There is a mountain in the western part of the Tibetan Plateau that has never been climbed. Not because it is the tallest, or the most technically demanding, or the most remote. There are mountains that tick all of those boxes and have still been conquered. This one sits at just over 6,600 meters above sea level, well within the range of what experienced mountaineers handle regularly. And yet, in all of recorded history, not a single person has reached its summit. No confirmed attempt has ever made it. That fact alone would be enough to make Mount Kailash one of the more unusual places on the planet. But the story doesn't stop there. Not even close. Mount Kailash sits in the Ngari Prefecture of Tibet, close to the borders of India and Nepal. It is considered one of the most sacred sites in the world, central to 4 major religions: Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Bon. Each tradition holds it in the highest possible regard, though for reasons that differ in their detail. Hindus believe it to be the earthly home of the god Shiva. Buddhists regard it as a mandala, a physical representation of the universe in perfect form. For followers of Jainism, it is the site where their first spiritual teacher attained liberation. The Bon religion, one of Tibet's oldest spiritual traditions, considers it the axis around which all spiritual power rotates. 4 completely distinct belief systems, each arriving at the same conclusion independently. This mountain is unlike any other place on Earth. For most of modern history, the outside world paid relatively little attention to Kailash. It was remote, it was politically restricted, and the claims made about it by pilgrims and monks were easy to dismiss as religious metaphor. That began to change slowly as more researchers, mountaineers, and independent journalists started documenting their experiences in the region. What they reported did not always fit neatly into conventional explanations. Strange instrument failures, disorientation, physical symptoms that appeared without obvious cause, a persistent, almost universal sense among visitors that the place operated by rules that were different from everywhere else. Then, in early 2024, a monk named Chen Huimin gave an interview that circulated widely among researchers of unexplained phenomena and alternative history. Chen Huimin was 94 years old at the time, a resident of a monastery in China's Qinghai province, and by all accounts someone who had maintained strict silence on certain subjects for the better part of 6 decades. What he chose to say, and the timing of it, immediately drew attention from people who had been studying Kailash for years. According to Chen Huimin, the monastery he had lived in for most of his adult life was home to a collection of texts that had been kept from public knowledge for centuries. He described them as ancient documents, written in a form of script that only a small number of monks within the tradition were trained to read. The texts had been preserved beneath the monastery, passed down through generations of custodians who understood their contents to be sensitive enough that revealing them carried genuine risk. Chen Huimin said he had debated internally for years whether to speak. His decision to finally do so, he indicated, was driven by his age and by a sense that the information had been withheld long enough. The core of what Chen Huimin described was this: the texts do not treat Mount Kailash as a mountain in the geological sense. They describe it as a structure, something that was designed and placed in its location deliberately by a group of beings who, according to the texts, existed on Earth long before modern humans. The language used in the original documents, as Chen Huimin described it through a translator, refers to the mountain as something closer to a device or a mechanism, a thing with a function. The monks who preserved these texts used a term that translates roughly as the anchor point, a name that implies the mountain is not just sitting there passively, but is actively doing something. What it is doing, according to the texts, relates primarily to the land around it. Chen Huimin described the ancient documents as stating that the mountain generates a field of influence that extends outward from the peak for a significant distance in all directions. Within that area, the texts say, the normal behavior of time and physical matter is altered. People age more rapidly. Electronic and mechanical devices stop working, and those who push too close to the summit are subjected to psychological experiences severe enough to make continued approach feel impossible. Chen Huimin was careful, reportedly, to distinguish between what the texts literally said and his own interpretation of them. He described himself not as someone making claims about what is true, but as someone relaying what had been written down by people who came before him. That distinction matters. He is reporting the contents of documents. Whether those documents are accurate is a separate question entirely. What makes the interview notable is not that a monk said something unusual about a sacred mountain. That happens regularly across many traditions. What makes it notable is the specificity. The texts Chen Huimin described are not vague or symbolic in their language, at least as he conveyed them. They give measurements. They describe mechanisms. They outline a theory of what the mountain is and why it behaves the way it does that is internally consistent and, in several respects, lines up with things that independent observers have documented over the past century without any knowledge of these texts. The most striking of those alignments involves time. Chen Huimin said the ancient documents describe an area near Kailash where time does not behave normally. The phrasing he used, relayed through translation, was that time near the mountain pools and accelerates rather than flowing at a consistent rate. People who enter the influence zone described in the texts are said to emerge from it physically changed in ways that suggest they have experienced far more time than the clock would indicate. Hair gone grey, tissue deteriorated, cellular damage that should take years compressed into hours. This description, unusual as it is not something Chen Huimin invented. Accounts of exactly this kind of physical change have been reported by outside observers going back decades, completely independent of any monastic tradition. Russian altitude medicine researcher Dr. Yuri Vulov documented one such case in 1999, encountering a group of Siberian climbers returning from Kailash's slopes who showed signs of dramatic physical aging after what should have been a brief excursion. His private journal, which was not published until after his death, described their condition in clinical detail and expressed complete bewilderment at what he observed. That convergence between what ancient texts say and what modern observers have independently recorded is the thing that serious researchers find difficult to dismiss outright. It does not prove anything, but it raises a question that is hard to walk away from. If this mountain is simply a mountain, why do so many different people, coming from completely different directions, keep arriving at the same strange conclusions about it? Chen Huimin, when asked directly what he believed the mountain ultimately was, paused for a long time before answering. He said he did not think it was his place to tell people what to believe. What he could say was what the text described, and the text described a machine, an old one that was built for a purpose that humanity has not yet been trusted to fully understand. And according to everything written in those documents, it is still running. Of all the strange things reported about Mount Kailash over the centuries, the accounts involving time are the ones that tend to stop people mid-sentence. Not because they are the most dramatic on the surface, but because they are the most specific. Vague feelings of unease, psychological pressure, a general sense that something is wrong. Those kinds of reports are easy to attribute to altitude, isolation, or the power of suggestion. What is harder to explain away are the physical measurements. Hair that has grown weeks longer than the shoulds, timeline allows. Nails extended well past their normal length. Tissue damage consistent with decades of aging, found in men who had only been on the mountain for half a day. These are not feelings. They are observable, documentable physical facts, and they have been reported by people with no connection to each other, across different decades, with no apparent motive to fabricate. The starting point for understanding these reports is the geography. Kailash sits at the center of what researchers have come to call an influence zone, a term borrowed loosely from the language of the ancient texts described by Chen Huimin, but also used independently by several scientists and explorers who have worked in the region. The idea is that the mountain does not only affect those who attempt the summit, Its effects, whatever their cause, appear to extend outward across a considerable radius. Pilgrims and trekkers who never go anywhere near the upper slopes have still reported physical changes after spending extended time in the surrounding area. The closer to the peak, the more pronounced those changes appear to become. This pattern is consistent across a wide range of accounts, which is part of what makes it difficult to dismiss. If only summit climbers reported unusual symptoms, it would be easier to attribute everything to extreme altitude and the severe physiological stress that comes with it. But the reports come from people at varying distances, varying altitudes, and varying levels of physical condition. The common thread is not the height. The common thread is the mountain. The most clinically detailed account in the modern record comes from Dr. Yuri Vulov, a Russian researcher who spent 20 years studying high-altitude medicine before his encounter near Kailash in 1999. Vulov was not in the region to study the mountain specifically. He was leading a broader scientific expedition and had a reputation among colleagues as a rigorous, unsentimental researcher, not someone prone to exaggeration or mystical thinking. What he encountered that year was significant enough that he abandoned his expedition entirely and left the region earlier than planned. Vulov came across a group of Siberian climbers who were returning from time spent on Kailash's slopes. The encounter was, by his own account, immediately unsettling. The men looked wrong, not in a way that could be explained by exhaustion or the ordinary wear of a difficult trek. They looked substantially older than they had any right to look, given the time frame involved. They had been gone for approximately 12 hours. 12 hours is not long enough for the kind of physical changes Vulov was looking at. Hair that had been dark when they left was streaked heavily with grey. Beards had grown to a length that would normally take several weeks. Fingernails had extended well past what 12 hours of growth would produce. The skin on their faces showed deep lines and a loss of elasticity that Vulov, with his medical background, associated with men considerably older than these climbers were. He arranged for medical examinations before the group left the area. The findings were, by his account, inexplicable within the framework of anything he had encountered in 2 decades of medical research. The internal picture matched the external one. Organ function showed deterioration consistent with men in their late 70s or 80s. Cellular damage of a kind that normally accumulates over decades had occurred in the space of a single afternoon. Blood work showed stress markers at levels that indicated the bodies of these men had, in some measurable biological sense, lived through a vastly longer period than the clock suggested. Vulov kept a private journal throughout his career and wrote about this encounter in considerable detail. The journal was not made public during his lifetime. After his death, portions of it were shared by people close to him, and the section dealing with the 1999 encounter has since circulated among researchers interested in the Kailash phenomenon. In it, he describes the climber's psychological state alongside the physical findings. They were disoriented. They could not agree among themselves on how long they had been on the mountain. One man was insistent that they had been gone for weeks. Another was equally certain it had only been a matter of hours. When Vulov and his team pressed them for clarity, the group became agitated and, in at least one instance, briefly aggressive. That kind of confusion and conflict over basic facts about a shared experience is, in itself, a clinically notable symptom. The detail Vulov returned to repeatedly in his journal was their eyes. He wrote that the men did not look frightened, which might have been understandable given what they had apparently been through. They looked empty, as if some portion of whatever they had been before going up the mountain had not come back down with them. He described it as the look of people who had witnessed something that had quietly removed part of who they were, without asking and without warning. All of the men in that group died within 2 years. Heart failure, organ collapse, conditions that are simply not consistent with healthy men in their 30s, which is what most of them were. Vulov noted in his journal that the medical causes of death, while real and documented, felt to him like the final chapter of something that had already been decided on that mountain that afternoon. He did not have a scientific framework for that conclusion. He wrote it anyway. These deaths are not an isolated pattern. Multiple sources, including accounts collected by researchers who have spent years interviewing people in the communities surrounding Kailash, describe a recurring sequence: time spent on the slopes, physical changes that exceed what the duration of exposure should produce, followed by a deterioration of health in the months and years afterward that eventually proves fatal. The timescale varies. The outcome does not. Chen Huimin's description of the ancient texts offers one framework for understanding what might be happening, though it is important to be clear that it is a framework drawn from religious and philosophical documents of unknown origin, not from peer-reviewed science. According to the texts as he described them, the mountain generates a field within which time does not move at a consistent rate. The language used, filtered through translation, suggests that within this field, time compresses. A body inside the field experiences duration at a rate faster than the outside world. Someone spending 12 hours within range of the mountain might, in a biological sense, be living through something closer to years. When they walk out, their body carries the evidence of that extended exposure, even though the clocks tell a different story. That concept is not, it should be said, entirely without parallel in mainstream physics. Einstein's theory of general relativity established over a century ago that time is not a fixed constant. It moves at different rates depending on gravitational conditions and velocity. The effect, known as time dilation, has been measured and confirmed experimentally. Atomic clocks placed at high altitude tick measurably faster than identical clocks at sea level because gravity is slightly weaker and the effect on space-time is different. The discrepancies are tiny in everyday life, far too small to produce the kind of dramatic aging reported near Kailash. But the principle that time can be distorted by physical conditions is not fringe science. It is foundational physics. What the Kailash reports suggest, if taken seriously, is that whatever is producing these effects is operating at a scale and intensity many orders of magnitude beyond anything currently understood. The text describe the anchor point as generating a field. Physics does not currently have a mechanism to explain a field that produces observable biological aging in hours. That gap between what is reported and what can be explained is large, but the existence of that gap is not by itself evidence that nothing is happening. It may simply mean that whatever is happening is something science has not yet developed the tools to measure or describe. The pilgrimage tradition around Kailash adds another layer to this. For thousands of years, Hindus and Buddhists have walked a circuit around the mountain called the Kora, a roughly 52-kilometer path that encircles the base. The belief, consistent across both traditions, is that completing the circuit produces spiritual merit and, in some interpretations, literally removes years of accumulated negative karma. Pilgrims often describe a physical lightness after completing the walk, a sense of having shed something heavy. Chen Huimin pointed to this tradition specifically when discussing the texts. He suggested that the idea of time exchange embedded in the pilgrimage ritual was not metaphorical in origin. The ancient texts, he said, describe the circuit as a literal interaction with the time field the mountain generates. Walk the outer edge and the effect is mild, possibly even beneficial. Approach the summit and it becomes violent and irreversible. That distinction between the outer circuit and the inner approach appears in the independent accounts as well. Pilgrims who complete the Kora generally report positive experiences, or at least neutral ones. It is the people who push inward, who attempt to get closer to the peak itself, who accumulate the kind of damage that ends lives early. The mountain in this reading does not punish everyone equally. It punishes proximity. What is left when all the accounts are laid out together is a picture that is genuinely difficult to resolve cleanly in either direction. The skeptical explanations, high altitude, psychological stress, coincidence, confirmation bias, cover some of what is reported, but not all of it. The physical evidence documented by Vulov does not fit comfortably into any conventional medical category. The pattern of early deaths among those who spent extended time near the summit is statistically unusual, even if no single case is impossible on its own. The mountain has been doing this, if the accounts are to be believed, for as long as people have been paying attention. And the people who have paid the most sustained attention, the monks who have lived in its shadow for generations, say that time near Kailash does not work the way time works everywhere else. They have been saying that for centuries. The modern record, frustratingly, does not give clear reason to tell them they are wrong. If the accounts involving time distortion are the most medically specific of the Kailash reports, then the accounts involving psychology and technology are the most consistently documented across the widest range of independent sources. These are not stories confined to monks or mystics. They come from military navigators, professional mountaineers, commercial airline pilots, documentary filmmakers, and engineering technicians. people whose professions are built around precision, observation, and the systematic elimination of error. And nearly all of them, when they describe their experiences near Kailash, arrive at the same uncomfortable conclusion. Something in that region interferes with both the human mind and the machines that humans build, in ways that cannot be adequately explained by anything currently in the standard toolkit of science or medicine. The psychological dimension of this is perhaps the harder one to discuss objectively, because psychological experiences are inherently subjective and therefore easier to dismiss. Feeling watched, feeling unwelcome, feeling an irrational and overwhelming certainty that continuing forward would end badly, none of those experiences produce the kind of hard physical evidence that Vulov's medical records did. But what makes the psychological reports from Kailash worth taking seriously is not any single account. It is the repetition. The same descriptions, the same specific sensations, reported by people with no connection to each other across more than a century of recorded expeditions. When the language used by a British mountaineer in 1926 maps almost exactly onto the language used by a Russian climber in 2001, without either of them having access to the other's account, that convergence becomes harder to set aside. Hugh Rutledge was a veteran British mountaineer who spent 3 weeks studying Kailash in 1926, examining it from multiple approaches and assessing whether a summit attempt was feasible. His credentials were solid. He had extensive experience in the Himalayas and was not someone given to dramatic statements or loose talk about feelings. His expedition notes, which survive, do not cite ice conditions or technical difficulty as the reason he ultimately declared the mountain unclimbable. What he wrote about instead was a feeling, a pressure that built in his chest as he got closer, a growing certainty that the mountain was aware of his presence in some way he could not rationally account for, and that it did not want him there. He wrote that leaving did not feel like a strategic retreat. It felt like being permitted to leave. That specific framing, the sense of being released rather than withdrawing, appears in multiple accounts from different periods and from people who could not have been influenced by Rutledge's notes. His local guides, experienced men who knew the terrain well, refused to continue at a certain point. Several of them experienced nightmares severe enough to wake them in visible distress. Rutledge documented this not as superstition on their part, but as a practical problem for the expedition. Whatever they were experiencing was real enough in its effects to make them physically unable to continue, regardless of its ultimate cause. The 2001 Spanish climbing team presents a more recent and more detailed version of the same pattern. This was a serious expedition, made up of climbers with records that included Everest and K2. They had secured one of the rarest permits in mountaineering, an official authorization to attempt the summit of Kailash, which the Chinese and Tibetan authorities almost never grant. These were not casual trekkers or spiritual pilgrims. They were elite technical climbers with the equipment, the experience, and the legal permission to do something that had never been done. They never made it past base camp. The accounts from team members describe a progression that is consistent with what other expeditions have reported. It did not start dramatically. The early symptoms were things that could plausibly be attributed to altitude or fatigue, mild nausea, a vague unease. Then, as they moved closer to the mountain, the experiences intensified in ways that became impossible to rationalize. Hallucinations involving loved ones in distress, visions of the ground opening, movement in peripheral vision that vanished when looked at directly. The nausea became acute and then disappeared without explanation. And underlying all of it, building steadily as they approached, was a shared psychological state that the climbers struggled to describe but were consistent in reporting. An absolute bone-deep certainty that going further would result in something worse than dying. Not death itself. Something worse than that. None of them could say what that meant. All of them felt it with equal conviction. Russian climber Sergei Chisakov gave an interview about his experience near Kailash that was later suppressed by local authorities, though portions of it have circulated since through researchers and journalists who covered the story at the time. Chisakov was visibly shaken during the interview, by multiple accounts chain-smoking throughout and refusing to make direct eye contact with the camera. His translator noted that Chisakov had not been sleeping properly for months by the time the interview was recorded. He was careful to distinguish between what he experienced as normal altitude sickness, which he had dealt with many times before and knew well, and what happened near Kailash. The altitude symptoms were familiar. What came alongside them was not. A thought, he said, that repeated itself continuously in his mind. You do not belong here. He was explicit that this did not feel like his own thought. It felt, he said, like something coming from outside, pressing against the inside of his skull like a hand pushing through from the other side. The moment he made the decision to turn back, every symptom stopped. Instantly. The pressure lifted. The thought ceased. He described the relief as so intense that he wept. That instantaneous cessation of symptoms at the moment of deciding to retreat is another detail that appears across multiple independent accounts and that has no obvious conventional explanation. Chen Huimin, when presented with these accounts, said the ancient texts describe this phenomenon in specific terms. The documents apparently call it the field of rejection, and they describe it not as a random or chaotic force, but as something targeted and intelligent in its operation. According to the texts, the field identifies what each individual person is most vulnerable to psychologically and amplifies that specific vulnerability until retreat becomes the only option the mind will accept. It is not a blanket assault. It is, if the texts are to be believed, a personalized one. That detail is striking because it aligns with something the climbers themselves often noted. The experiences were deeply personal. The hallucinations involved their specific loved ones. The fears that surfaced were their specific fears. Whatever was happening did not feel generic. It felt tailored. The technology failures follow a different pattern, but point toward the same conclusion. These are not psychological experiences. They are mechanical and electronic malfunctions that can be measured, examined after the fact, and compared against the known performance specifications of the equipment involved. And the picture that emerges from those comparisons is, if anything, more straightforwardly puzzling than the psychological reports. Compasses do not function reliably near Kailash. This has been documented extensively enough that it is now something experienced trekkers and expedition leaders factor into their planning before entering the region. The behavior of compass needles near the mountain is not the gradual drift that might be expected near unusual rock formations with high iron content. It is more dramatic than that. Needles spin continuously without settling, or lock into a fixed position and refuse to respond to any movement. A German expedition in 2015 brought 6 compasses from 3 different manufacturers, a sensible redundancy measure for any serious mountain expedition. All 6 failed simultaneously within 8 kilometers of the peak. The expedition leader, who had a background in military navigation and had worked with compasses in some of the most magnetically complex environments on Earth, described watching all 6 needles spinning in perfect synchronization, as if they were responding to the same source. He had no explanation for it then, and has offered none since. The aerial dimension of the technology failures is in some ways the most striking, because aircraft are among the most heavily instrumented machines ever built. Commercial and military aircraft carry multiple redundant systems, specifically designed to ensure that no single failure can compromise the whole. Near Kailash, those redundancies appear not to help. Pilots who have flown routes near the region describe experiences that their instruments have no framework to account for. Altimeters showing numbers that are physically impossible, given the aircraft's actual position, heading indicators spinning in the wrong direction. Complete signal loss that begins and ends precisely in relation to proximity to the peak, restoring itself fully once the aircraft moves out of range. Turbulence appears instantaneously in clear conditions, not building gradually as turbulence normally does, but arriving and departing without transition, as if passing through a boundary. One commercial pilot who spoke on condition of anonymity described flying the route dozens of times over his career. On every single flight, he said, something happens that should not be possible. He and his co-pilots do not discuss it with each other, and they do not report it in ways that would draw formal attention. But they all know it happens, and they all expect it. That kind of normalized silence among professionals about a consistent and unexplained phenomenon is itself worth noting. Documentary crews attempting to use drones to capture footage of the summit, which no human has ever seen, have fared no better. Most drones sent toward the slopes have either lost signal entirely and fallen straight down, or returned footage so corrupted and distorted as to be unusable. Engineers examining the recovered equipment have found no physical damage to explain the failures. The devices worked normally before they entered the area near the mountain, and worked normally again once removed from it. Whatever caused the malfunction left no trace on the hardware itself. The twin lakes that sit at the base of Kailash add a further dimension to this picture that sits somewhere between the physical and the perceptual. Lake Manasaravar and Rakshastal are separated by a narrow strip of land and could not be more different from each other despite their proximity. Manasaravar is fresh water, its surface unusually still even in high winds, and it does not freeze over at extreme altitude when every other body of water in the region does. Rakshastal is saline, and its surface churns continuously regardless of wind conditions, as if disturbed from beneath. Travelers who stand between the two lakes consistently describe a sense of crossing an invisible boundary, of standing at a threshold between opposing forces, though they struggle to say what those forces are. Chen Huimin described the lakes in terms drawn from ancient texts. The documents apparently refer to them as the mountain's eyes, one watching the sky and one watching what lies below the surface of the earth, together forming a surveillance system that observes everything approaching Kailash from any direction. Whether or not that framing is taken literally, the behavior of the lakes and the land around them has been documented as genuinely unusual. Lights move across the surface of Manasaravar at night, not reflections of stars but independent points of light, moving in patterns that suggest direction and purpose. The water changes color in ways that have no clear geological cause. The land around both lakes shifts subtly between visits, trails appearing and disappearing, landmarks failing to match what previous maps recorded, not through any dramatic change, but through a quiet, persistent inconsistency that makes reliable navigation through the area surprisingly difficult. Photographs taken at the lakes frequently fail to match what the people who took them remember seeing. Sounds behave strangely, arriving at the wrong moment or not at all. Echoes persist longer than the terrain should produce them. The overall experience of the area, reported consistently across many different visitors, is of a place where perception itself is slightly but persistently unreliable, where the information coming in through the senses cannot quite be trusted to represent what is actually there. Taken individually, any one of these phenomena could be explained. Compass anomalies occur near unusual geological formations. Pilots encounter instrument problems. Lakes, at high altitude, behave in ways that can seem unusual to people unfamiliar with the conditions. Psychological stress at extreme altitude can produce strange experiences, but the concentration of all of these things in one location, across one mountain, reported by independent observers spanning more than a century, is a pattern that resists easy dismissal. Something is happening near Kailash. What it is, and what is producing it, remains genuinely open. There is something about the shape of Mount Kailash that has unsettled geologists, mathematicians, and architects who have studied it closely, and it has nothing to do with the reports of time distortion or psychological pressure or failing compasses. It has to do with geometry. Specifically, it has to do with the fact that the mountain does not look the way a mountain formed by natural geological processes is supposed to look. Most Himalayan peaks are asymmetrical. They have been pushed up by tectonic forces and then carved over, millennia by glaciers moving in different directions at different rates, which produces irregular, jagged, unpredictable forms. The asymmetry is not a flaw. It is the expected signature of natural mountain-building processes operating across geological time. Kailash does not follow that pattern. The mountain rises with a degree of symmetry that, even by the account of researchers who believe there is a conventional geological explanation for it, is extraordinarily rare. 4 faces descend from the peak toward the 4 cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west, with a precision of alignment that is difficult to account for through random natural processes. The edges between those faces are clean and measured. From virtually every angle of approach, the mountain presents the same proportioned pyramidal form. It looks, to many who have seen it, less like something that grew and more like something that was made. Researchers who have examined the geometry in detail have noted that the degree of symmetry, combined with the precise cardinal orientation and the preservation of that form over what must be an immense span of geological time, places Kailash in a category that has very few members. There are other pyramidal peaks in the world. Geology can produce them, but the combination of factors present at Kailash, the symmetry, the orientation, the scale, and the consistency of form from every direction of approach is unusual enough that even conventional geological explanations acknowledge how exceptional it is. Chen Huimin went considerably further than calling it unusual. When he described the contents of the ancient texts on this subject, he was specific. The documents do not treat the mountain's shape as a geological curiosity. They state directly that it was constructed. The term used in the original texts, as he described it through translation, refers to shaped stone, implying deliberate design. Not a natural formation that happens to look a certain way, but something that was intentionally built to look and function exactly as it does. According to Chen Huimin, the texts describe the mountain as having been positioned at its specific location on the Earth's surface for reasons that were calculated rather than accidental, as part of a larger system of sites distributed across the planet at points that relate to each other through precise geometric alignments. To illustrate this, Chen Huimin drew a series of lines on a map during the interview. A line from Kailash to the Great Pyramid of Giza extended further, passed through Stonehenge. Another connected Kailash to Easter Island. A third ran to Angkor Wat in Cambodia. A fourth to the ancient city of Petra in Jordan. The claim attached to these alignments is that their probability of occurring by chance is vanishingly small, with some researchers who have studied the question putting the figure at less than 1 in 10 million. Whether or not that specific calculation is accepted, the hard alignments themselves have been noted and examined by multiple independent researchers, some of whom have no connection to the monastic tradition Chen Huimin represents. The idea that these ancient sites sit at geometrically related points on the Earth's surface is not a new one, and it is not exclusively a spiritual claim. It has been examined as a mathematical question, and the results are at minimum thought-provoking. What the texts apparently describe, if Chen Huimin's account is accurate, is something that researchers in alternative history have discussed for decades under various names. An ancient global infrastructure, a network of sites positioned at specific points on the Earth's surface and connected to each other through a system that made use of properties of the planet that modern science has not fully mapped. In this framework, Kailash is not simply one node among many. It is the central point, the hub from which the rest of the network operates. The machine, as the texts apparently call it, that makes the other sites function. That is an enormous claim, and it requires an equally enormous foundation to be taken seriously. Chen Huimin did not present it as speculation. He presented it as the content of documents that have been preserved and studied within his tradition for centuries. Documents that describe the engineering logic behind the mountain's placement and the purpose it was designed to serve. Whether those documents are accurate records of actual ancient knowledge, or the accumulated mythological thinking of a tradition that predates modern science by many generations, is a question that cannot currently be answered with certainty in either direction. What can be said is that the 4 major rivers of Asia that originate in the Kailash region, the Indus, the Sutlej, the Brahmaputra, and the Karnali, flow outward from the mountain in 4 directions and collectively sustain close to half of the world's human population. That is a geographical fact, not a spiritual claim. The monks have noted for centuries that the mountain sits at the source point of these rivers, feeding life across an enormous portion of the planet. Whether that positioning was deliberate or coincidental is precisely the kind of question that the ancient texts, as described by Chen Huimin, claim to answer directly. The final revelation Chen Huimin described from the texts is the one that generated the most attention after the interview circulated. He spoke of a chamber. Not a cave in the conventional sense, not a tomb or a storage space, but something the texts apparently describe in its own distinct category. The documents call it the Hall of Records, and they place it deep beneath the mountain itself. According to Chen Huimin's account of the texts, this chamber contains documentation that predates human civilization by tens of thousands of years, not religious texts, not mythology. Records in the most literal sense, detailed accounts of human origins, of where the species came from, of capabilities and histories that have been lost or deliberately removed from the accessible record. And alongside that historical documentation, something that is harder to categorize, descriptions of future events. A period the texts apparently refer to as the Turning, a transformation of human existence whose nature the documents describe, but which Chen Huimin said he did not fully understand from his reading of them. He used the phrase "the seed of the next world" when summarizing what the texts say is contained in the chamber. He was careful to say that he did not know precisely what that phrase meant in practical terms. What he was clear about was the text's position on when this knowledge would become available, not on any human schedule and not through any human decision. The mountain, according to the ancient documents, will determine when the chamber's contents are revealed. Every defense the mountain maintains, the time distortion, the psychological pressure, the technology failures, the watching lakes, exist to ensure that what is inside remains sealed until a threshold is reached that the texts do not precisely define. When asked directly how humanity would know when that threshold had been reached, Chen Huimin said something that has stayed with many of the researchers who heard it. He said that the question assumed humanity would be the one doing the knowing. The texts, he said, do not describe it that way. The decision is not ours to make and never has been. The mountain has been making that determination quietly and continuously for longer than any human tradition can remember. All of the phenomena that people have documented around Kailash, all the strange deaths and failed instruments and broken minds, are in this reading not random events or geological quirks. They are the mountain doing its job, assessing, filtering, deciding, over and over again, that the time has not yet come. That may be the most unsettling part of the entire account. Not the time distortion or the psychological defenses or the impossible geometry, but the implication that all of it is purposeful. That there is something beneath that mountain that is, by the account of people who have studied these texts for generations, genuinely significant for the human species. And that access to it is being controlled by something that is not human and does not operate on a human timescale. Kailash has stood in that position on the Tibetan Plateau through the rise and fall of every major civilization in recorded history. It has watched empires come and go. It has outlasted every human institution that has ever tried to study it or explain it or claim authority over it. And according to the monks who have lived closest to it for the longest time, it is not finished yet. Whatever it is waiting for, it has not arrived. And until it does, the mountain will continue doing exactly what the texts say it was built to do.